Back for another episode, and I'm thrilled to have Loren Steffy with me. Loren, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks once again for having me.
Loren, I wanted to visit with you about the recently concluded biennial Texas legislative session. And I'm not sure if the title of this episode should be, thank God they only meet 140 days every 2 years, or it could have been worse. You have a third potential title.
Yeah, maybe the third potential title is So What?
We had two special sessions to get some property tax relief pushed through. So that's got everybody's attention. But there were several other initiatives that got passed, but then died in the governor's lap because he refused to sign the bills. What are some of the big themes you saw in this session?
Yeah, I was only being somewhat facetious with my So What comment. I saw a lot of things that got done when we look at things like issues like water infrastructure, the electricity grid. There were some measures that were made that were designed to improve situation, but at the end of the day, it's not really accomplishing anything that we need in terms of overall reliability, dependability, things like that. I think the thing you keep hearing, I run into more and more people who talk about how I'm putting solar panels on my house and generators, and because it's like you can't count on the electricity or the water system to continue to operate. So you got to figure out your own way of protecting yourself. And it's just, these are the things that sooner or later the legislature is going to have to tackle. And it's just, they keep putting it off.
So let's focus on the energy component, because in addition to some workarounds on energy infrastructure, this legislature went after the renewable energies. And they, of course, characterized it as leveling the playing field. But in my comment of it could have been worse, really came, I think, from one of the renewable companies, or at least their lobbyists. So where do we stand now with the vast renewables? And indeed, Texas, I think, has the largest number of wind farms in America.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of the support for those industries has gone away, and largely because of this attitude that we've got to do more favors for the fossil fuel industry. This is the same policies we've seen all along. Look, when you look at renewables, for example, we had a quote unquote deregulated power grid, which you and I've talked about before, and it did not create adequate incentives to build thermal generation to meet the needs of the state. But it was pretty effective at creating incentive to build wind and solar facilities, which helps to meet the energy needs of the state. The fix here then is to find a better way to create incentives for thermal generation, but not at the cost of renewables. We still need that kind of baseline generating capacity, which has to grow because the state's population is growing. You need power that you can be sure is going to be there regardless of the weather conditions. On a still day, you're not going to get a lot of wind power. On a cloudy day, you're not going to get a lot of solar power, right? So you need another source to fill in those gaps. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that wind and solar are bad or that it doesn't help the overall scheme. So I think there's just this fundamentally wrong-headed attitude about where we're headed with this stuff. Given the growth that we've seen in Texas, and given water demands in addition to power demands, it takes a tremendous amount of water to generate conventional electricity. Solar and wind, those are going to play a role in the future, and it's just silly to think that it's not.
So did we disincentivize renewables so that they will no longer be cost effective for construction of new solar or wind solar farms or wind towers?
We've certainly made it a lot more difficult, especially when it comes to wind farms. I think we've seen a lot of disincentive in that area. Solar is a little trickier because solar kind of plays on two levels. You have the sort of large scale arrays, which also were disincentivized under these bills. But you also, keep in mind, have distributed solar, which is where people put solar panels on their houses. And I think that's going to continue because a lot of people want it. And it's something that happens to some degree outside of legislative control. Most of the tax credits that homeowners get for those kinds of installations are federal, not state. And the only issue that comes up from a state standpoint is whether the regulated transmission grid operator will accept power back onto the grid. But honestly, for a lot of people, that's a secondary thing. What they want is the reliability, and they want solar power that will feed batteries in their house, maybe charge their electric vehicles if they have them, but certainly provide some backup for times of emergency.
Let's turn to public education, or education, maybe a little bit broader term. The governor made clear he wanted to take public funds, monies to fund private education. Where did we end up?
Yeah, he did not get what he wanted, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. I thought that was I was gone for a couple of weeks. Something could have happened. Yeah, he's been trying very hard to get this voucher program through. There's a lot of opposition to it. It amounts to is a massive transfer of wealth from taxpayers to, private companies that are running these schools. And in many cases, the schools don't have the same accountability that public school systems have. But the interesting thing when it comes to school vouchers, that's an issue that both urban and rural voters can be rather united on. Or I should say, urban Democratic voters and rural Republican voters actually see eye to eye on this, because what's happening in rural areas where they're already fighting to keep their schools open, where they don't have the tax base for a lot of the funding that they need, you're now talking about the opportunity for people to take some of that money, siphon it off, and give it to private schools, most of which, let's face it, are not going to be opening in rural areas. And so it is something that rural voters in particular have been very concerned about. And that's why there hasn't been more sort of widespread support by this. What you're really talking about is creating an education system that is very exclusive and very elite, and not really at all designed to do what public education, not just in Texas, but in the United States, has always been designed to do, which is educate everybody.
And I was really intrigued by, as you correctly noted, the sort of wedding, or at least marriage by convenience, of rural Republican voters, particularly in West Texas, and urban Democrats. And I was even more intrigued by the other rural Republican argument of, you will destroy our football teams because we won't have access to the best athletes anymore. And I thought that was a really interesting argument as well, and particularly out of Odessa Permian, of all places.
And while I have very strong feelings about the whole football thing in public education, I will say if that's what it takes to bring everybody together, so be it. I think it's actually wonderful and encouraging to see two groups that have a lot of disparate interests. They don't have a lot of common ground. We've seen so much of Texas politics breaking down over urban versus rural, and this is a really great area where people from very different backgrounds can come together and perhaps not work for change, but work to prevent something bad from happening. And I think it's encouraging, and I hope that we see more of it, because there's a lot of issues in the rural areas of the state that are not being addressed. I think that many of the state leaders, because those voters tend to vote Republican, most of the Republican leaders take their votes for granted. And there's a lot of economic issues that are going to be coming up, and they may need to rethink some of this.
The argument that I wanted to see play out that I didn't see was an analogy to rural hospitals, because many times rural hospitals have closed because they're simply not cost effective for the number of patients or number of people in a county or in a geographic area. And so that, of course, takes away healthcare. So it spirals downward. And I thought that was an interesting analogy to the rural schools, particularly around if they privatize and they only have private schools where there is profitability.
Yeah, I think it is a really great analogy, because we've definitely seen a sort of a draining of healthcare facilities, essentially accessibility to healthcare, even routine healthcare in a lot of rural areas. And if you have to drive 2-3 hours to a doctor, it makes it pretty tough. And that's something similar that could happen with education. And it just makes it look, Texas is a tough place to live just from an environmental standpoint. It's a harsh environment. We all know that. West Texas, it's remote in a lot of places. And while there's a lot of people who like that, and you and I out here in the hill country, we can certainly appreciate that. At the same time, you need basic services, and access to education is so critical. It shouldn't be something that is in any way diminished simply because somebody else somewhere else thinks they should have access to taxpayer funds that, quite frankly, they don't deserve.
In junior high school in Bryan, Texas, I had a history teacher who said something that has stuck with me since then, and it struck me then, and it still sticks with me. And her position, or she posited that the American high school created the American middle class. And that was the strength of America. And it was partly education, but it was more, it brought us all together. And obviously after integration, and she said, you're going to be around people you've never been around. And they're Americans and you're an American. And you're going to be living together the rest of your lives. And so that's always struck with me, that is that one of the jobs, or is that just an outcome of the public education system you alluded to?
Yeah, it may be an outcome more than a job, but keep in mind, our whole approach to education was based on the idea the founding educated society, an educated electorate was a beneficial thing for society overall. And we have always had an education system that provides services to everybody, regardless of your economic background, regardless of what learning disabilities you may have. My wife was a teacher for 25 years, and there was a time, I think it was maybe in the 90s, where everybody's looking at the Japanese education system and saying, oh, they perform so much better. And her point was always, yeah, because they don't take everybody. You know, if you were severely handicapped, there wasn't a place for you in their system. They relegated you to, they made decisions about who you were going to be or where you come in. And we saw that in Europe, right? That was one of the things the founding fathers wanted to get away from, was the class system. Other education systems track you for what you're going to be or what you're going to do with your life. And in America, we believe that with access to education, anybody can be anything. So it's really tied up in our whole notion of what America is and this idea of the American dream. And look, there's nothing wrong with public schools. If you want to send your kid to public school, go for it. And there's certainly a lot of problems with public education. There's a lot of schools that are underperforming, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think as a society, we have a responsibility to support those efforts to make the schools as good as they can be. And that doesn't mean taking the money that taxpayers contribute for this sort of overall education of society and giving it to a handful of people who are not going to let everybody in.
And I would say that in addition to the founding fathers of America, it's actually the founding fathers of the Republic of Texas, because I had a chance to
Yep.
take a look at those. And Mirabeau B. Lamar was the founder of the public university system. And then Anson Jones was the public school or education system, setting aside land in every township for a K through 12, what's now K through 12.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It is deeply ingrained in who we are, not just as Americans, but as Texans. So you got a double whammy there.
Why don't we say a few words about property tax reform, or rebates, if maybe that's the better word. This seemed to me to be a large brouhaha about not much, or perhaps so what. So what was your view on both the 140-day session and of course the two special sessions where they're able to hammer it out?
Yeah, I think what it really came down to was a disagreement over how we were going to reform property taxes, or how we were going to give people a break, if you will. And the governor really wanted to just basically come up with a way where the state essentially subsidize school property taxes. Everybody who pays taxes would get some sort of relief, and it based on how much you pay. Whereas Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, was very adamant that he wanted to raise the homestead exemption because that gives homeowners a break as opposed to businesses or commercial interests and that kind of thing. And okay, this is going to be one of those moments. I think Patrick was on the right track with that one, actually. I think that a big portion of the property tax relief that's needed is at the homeowner level. Commercial interests already get a lot of other tax favors and gimmies from the state. There's the Texas Enterprise Fund. There's all these other things. The real focus should have been on homeowners and ensuring there are people who are losing their homes because the tax rates are too high, and or at least people who are afraid that's going to be the outcome. And so I think the more you can do, raise the homeowners exemption, that kind of codifies it going forward. And I think that approach had merit. What they ultimately came up with was dual approach, which I guess is the way government works, right? We have a compromise, and that'll be fine. I think no matter what, homeowners are going to be very glad to be seeing some relief.
Maybe we could end with a few words about the impeachment of Ken Paxton, and how much or not did that play into the overall legislative session. The House voted to impeach the Attorney General. It goes to the Senate for trial, which will be held later this summer. The impeachment hearings in the House were largely, or at least the public hearings, were largely towards the end of the session, which seemed to really take the air out of all other legislative work. What was your assessment of the impeachment?
Yeah, it was interesting the way it unfolded. Just like you say, at the end of the session, it just like suddenly, normally the end of the session, there's this mad rush to get all the bills through and that kind of thing. And I'm sure that happened, but it didn't seem to be capturing as much attention as it normally does because everybody was focused on the impeachment trial. Being rather cynical about top politics, I found it interesting. Paxton there's been a lot of questions about Paxton's ethical behavior, and he's been under indictment forever. I think he's been elected twice while he's been under indictment and all this. Nobody really seemed certainly nobody on the Republican side seemed to care until he asked for state funds to pay for his legal settlement. And then suddenly it became an issue. And again, if that's what it takes, I'm glad to see that somebody's finally taking a look at this, but it shouldn't have taken this long or required this much effort for state leaders to do the right thing. This is one of the things that frustrates me about politics, especially in the current era, is the whole identity politics thing is if he's from my party, then, it doesn't matter. He's my guy and that must be great. And anything he does, we're going to look the other way. That's not how it's supposed to work. Again, that's not what the founding fathers or the founding Texans, that's not how they expected government to work. It's not how they expected voters or elected officials to behave. And so I think it is incumbent upon the parties when there is wrongdoing or serious question of wrongdoing to call out their own. And it took way, way too long to get to that point with regards to the Paxton situation.
I am sure we will be watching the trial in the Senate. They have four of the best lawyers in the state of Texas for a public trial, a TV trial, or any other trial. So frankly, I can't wait for those fireworks to occur.
It's going to be a very interesting end to the summer.
Loren, as always, it's been great. If somebody wanted to find out more about what you're up to, where would be the best place for them to go?
You can always go to my website, which is lorensteffy.com, or you can keep your eye on the internet. I show up in various places these days, so including this podcast.
Where's your publishing company found?
Yeah, so I also have a publishing company, Stony Creek Publishing, and we publish, and it's not just publishing my books, we publish other people's books as well, and that is stonycreekpublishing.com. In fact, we just overhauled the website, so we've got a fancy new website out there. We've got some interesting projects coming up, including, Tom, a new series we're starting called Podcasts in Print, and the very first one is the discussion that you and I did around my book, The Big Empty. That'll be out in early August.
Great. I'm greatly looking forward to that.
All right. Thanks a lot.